Have you ever witnessed a moment so infused with prejudice and ignorance that it seemed to stop time in its tracks? Imagine boarding a plane, minding your own business, when the flight staff, those meant to ensure your comfort and safety, turn their sneers and whispers against you. This is exactly what happens when Angela Woods, an elegant black woman on a critical mission, steps onto a flight bound for another corner of the world. Little do they know, Angela is an international ambassador for unwomen, and her attire carries deep cultural and personal significance. But the flight staff's mockery has set off a chain of events they'll soon regret. Angela Woods sat in the back seat of her black sedan as her driver maneuvered through the bustling streets of Atlanta, heading toward Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. The morning sun gleamed off skyscrapers as they whizzed by, reflecting Angela's own sense of determination and purpose. She was on her way to London for a high-profile conference under the banner of Unwomen, the United Nations entity dedicated to gender equality and women's empowerment. Although the demands of her role were immense, Angela loved every bit of her work. She believed in the transformative power of advocacy and had dedicated her life to championing the rights and welfare of women worldwide. Every detail of Angela's appearance today held significance. She wore a vibrant West African-inspired ensemble, a regal wrap skirt made of kente cloth in shades of gold and emerald, paired with a matching head wrap. This attire honored her late grandmother, who had taught her to never be ashamed of her cultural roots. Over the years, Angela had learned that her bold fashion choices served as both a statement of pride and an invitation for dialogue about her heritage. Despite the uncertain glances she sometimes received, Angela carried herself with dignity. Her style represented centuries of resilience, art, and community woven into every thread. Inside the car, her phone buzzed incessantly. Notification after notification rolled in, last-minute flight updates, messages from colleagues, and even an encouraging note from the Secretary General's office. Angela's schedule, as always, was jam-packed. After London, she was slated to speak at an international summit in Paris before heading to various countries across Africa and Asia. Though she was physically exhausted, her heart brimmed with excitement. Each new journey was another chance to give a voice to those who had been marginalized, to share stories from women's cooperatives, and to highlight the grassroots movements making a real impact on the ground. As the sedan pulled up at the airport terminal, Angela received a text from her personal assistant Tanya, who was waiting inside the departure lounge. They were both flying business class on Delta Airlines, thanks to a partnership that often sponsored travel for ambassadors and humanitarian workers. Angela's large suitcase contained essential documents, carefully packed gifts for various dignitaries, and most importantly, educational materials that included data she planned to present at the upcoming London conference. The slightest mishap could cause huge delays or overshadow her message, so she double-checked her passport, ID, boarding passes, and pressed her phone to confirm all the details were correct. Stepping out of the sedan, Angela noticed the hustle and bustle of travelers dragging suitcases, scanning itineraries on their phones, or bidding tearful goodbyes to loved ones. She took a moment to center herself, inhaling the crisp morning air. Even after years of traveling, airports still managed to evoke a sense of new beginnings in her. Yes, she was used to stares, especially when she wore her more traditional attire, but she had never let that deter her. She might be traveling to foreign lands, but her heritage traveled with her, a constant reminder of who she was and whom she served. With head held high, she walked toward the terminal doors, ready for another mission. Little did she know, the journey she was about to embark on would hold more challenges and surprises than any flight she'd taken before. Angela breezed through the initial security checks with Tanya by her side. They laughed about how excited they were to finally be meeting Dr. Maria Delgado, the keynote speaker at the London conference. Dr. Delgado's groundbreaking research on microfinance programs for rural women had inspired Angela when she was still a college student. The idea of now standing shoulder to shoulder with her at an international forum felt surreal. After passing security, they walked to the Delta Airlines Sky Club lounge. It was modern, chic, and surprisingly crowded this morning. Business travelers typed away on laptops, some lounged with headphones, while others clustered around the buffet table, choosing from fresh fruit and pastries. Angela placed her bag in a corner and sighed, relieved to have a few moments of respite. Tanya scrolled through her phone, checking emails. While they waited, a flight attendant in a crisp Delta uniform approached. Her name tag read Rebecca, and at first glance she seemed friendly enough. Her bright blonde hair was neatly pinned back, and her smile looked professionally practiced. "Good morning, ladies," Rebecca greeted them, though her eyes flickered more specifically over Angela. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" "Of course," Angela replied, offering the digital boarding pass on her phone. Tanya did the same. Rebecca nodded as she checked the details, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, an almost imperceptible narrowing, a momentary pause when she saw Angela's attire. "That's interesting outfit," Rebecca commented, struggling to keep her tone neutral. Tanya, quick to defend her friend, was about to interject, but Angela gently signaled for her to hold back. Angela had experienced this before: bemusement, curiosity, sometimes skepticism. Yet she chose to address it calmly. "Thank you," she replied with a measured smile. "It's traditional African wear. Very dear to me." Rebecca nodded and returned the phone. For a moment, Angela thought that would be the end of it. Then Rebecca's voice dropped slightly. "You might want to be mindful of how you present yourself on board, especially in business class. Some passengers can be sensitive." A flush crept up Tanya's cheeks. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice steely. Angela placed a hand on Tanya's arm. "It's okay," she said softly, turning back to the attendant. "I promise you there's nothing offensive about my clothing. These colors and patterns signify heritage, not hostility. Besides, I'm quite comfortable as I am." Rebecca offered a strained smile. "Of course. Enjoy your flight," she said, before walking away with a clipboard clutched to her chest. When she was out of earshot, Tanya's frustration spilled over. "I can't believe she implied you'd make other people uncomfortable. You have every right to wear whatever you want, especially clothing that holds cultural significance." Angela nodded. "I know, but from experience, sometimes it's best to address these microaggressions politely. We'll see if it was just her personal bias or something else. Either way, it won't stop me from doing my job." Yet a knot of unease had formed in Angela's stomach. She was used to small slights, but the fact that a flight attendant had been so quick to imply her clothing was an issue felt like a bad omen. She shook it off, determined not to let one person's prejudice affect her outlook. She had a speech to finalize and important negotiations ahead. If anything, Angela vowed that this incident would remind her why her work mattered so much. There were still barriers that needed breaking, barriers of ignorance and prejudice that lurked in seemingly ordinary interactions. "Let's go find some seats," she told Tanya, forcing a bright note into her voice. "We've got a long flight ahead. Might as well rest while we can." As they headed deeper into the lounge to settle down, neither of them realized that this was only the first glimmer of trouble that would cast its shadow on their journey. Angela and Tanya arrived at the gate just as the first business class boarding announcement rang out. They lined up, passports and boarding passes ready, eager to settle into their seats for the long flight from Atlanta to London Heathrow. The mood at the gate was a mix of anticipation and mild tension, typical of any international flight. Families tried to wrangle children, business people juggled calls and emails, and backpackers stared at flight information screens, looking slightly dazed. Angela noticed Rebecca again, now accompanied by two other flight attendants, Craig and Samantha, organizing the queue and scanning boarding passes. Craig, tall and well-groomed, wore a welcoming smile for each passenger. Samantha, a petite woman with chestnut brown hair, looked a bit stressed, flipping through her station's binder. Angela took a breath, recalling the odd interaction in the lounge. She decided to be cordial, hoping that the earlier remark was just a momentary lapse in sensitivity. When it was Angela's turn, she stepped forward and offered her boarding pass. Craig scanned it without issue and handed it back with a polite nod. Samantha smiled at Tanya, who followed closely behind. For a fleeting moment, Angela felt reassured. Perhaps the rest of the crew would be more professional than Rebecca had been. But just as she walked past, Angela caught sight of Rebecca, standing slightly behind the others. The attendant's eyes flicked downward, scanning Angela's outfit yet again. This time, her lips pressed together in disapproval. Angela sensed that uncomfortable tension once more. Tanya nudged Angela's elbow as if to say, "Ignore her." Angela gave a subtle nod. They proceeded down the jet bridge, the low hum of airplane engines vibrating in the background. Stepping onto the aircraft, they were greeted by a different flight attendant, Mikhail, who welcomed them warmly, checked their seat numbers, and directed them to the business class cabin. The seats were plush, arranged in a 1-to-1 configuration, giving each passenger aisle access. Overhead bins were nearly empty, which was a relief, as Angela and Tanya had large carry-ons with essential documents and personal items. As Angela settled into seat 4A, Tanya took 4B. They exchanged smiles, grateful to finally be on board. The plan was to rest for a couple of hours after takeoff, then spend part of the flight finalizing their presentations. Angela recalled the slides on microfinance success stories in Kenya, data from women's literacy programs in rural India, and an advocacy plan for tackling domestic violence legislation in Eastern Europe. All of these had to be precise, persuasive, and ready for review by the time they landed. Moments later, the cabin doors were prepared for departure. The pilot announced the flight time just under 8 hours and weather conditions along the route. Angela said a silent prayer for a safe journey and a successful mission. But even as she tried to focus on the tasks ahead, her thoughts drifted back to Rebecca. Why had the attendant seemed so focused on her attire? Sure, it was colorful and somewhat different from Western business wear, but Delta staff were usually trained to appreciate diverse cultural backgrounds. Was there something else behind that stare? Pushing these questions aside, Angela attempted to concentrate on adjusting her seat for maximum comfort. She glanced at Tanya, who was already sorting through a folder filled with notes. The flight attendants began their customary pre-takeoff tasks, demonstrating safety procedures, ensuring tray tables were stowed, seat belts fastened. Yet Angela couldn't help but notice Rebecca, now positioned in the aisle directly across from her, assisting a passenger. Their eyes briefly met, and Angela sensed an unspoken friction, a tension that unsettled her far more than she cared to admit. "It's just one flight," Angela told herself. "I've dealt with worse." But the spark of discomfort had already been lit, and neither Angela nor Tanya could have predicted just how much that spark would grow into a blaze of drama, prejudice, and unexpected karma by the time they touched down on the other side of the Atlantic. As the aircraft roared down the runway and lifted into the sky, Angela closed her eyes, listening to the engines thrum beneath her. She pictured the lush hills of rural communities she had visited, the bright faces of women entrepreneurs who had defied odds to create their own businesses, and the warm welcomes from families who saw her as a beacon of hope. Those memories steadied her, reminding her why she endured long flights and the occasional cold shoulder. About an hour into the flight, meal service began. Craig came around to distribute hot towels and menus for lunch. He was polite and friendly, making small talk about how this flight was usually filled with business executives heading to London for finance or tech conferences. He offered Angela a glass of champagne, which she politely declined in favor of still water, citing her preference to stay hydrated. Craig nodded and left with a wink of acknowledgement. The next round of service came a few minutes later, when Samantha offered bread from a basket, baguettes, dinner rolls, and multigrain options. Angela took a whole wheat roll and Tanya selected a baguette. Both women thanked Samantha, who smiled warmly. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said before moving on. Everything seemed normal, almost pleasant, until Angela noticed Rebecca approaching from the galley with the meal trays. From where Angela sat, she could see Rebecca exchange whispers with another crew member before turning her gaze in Angela's direction. The expression on Rebecca's face was unmistakably disdainful. Angela felt her heartbeat quicken. She'd encountered prejudice many times, but something about Rebecca's manner was overt, almost as though she was daring Angela to notice. "Here's your lunch," Rebecca said tersely as she placed a tray on Angela's table. She did the same for Tanya, but offered no pleasantries. Then, just loud enough for Angela to hear, she muttered under her breath, "At least it's something you can appreciate." It took Angela a second to register the insult. She exchanged a bewildered look with Tanya, who was already bristling. "Excuse me?" Angela asked, keeping her voice low and respectful. Her training as a diplomat had taught her to choose her battles and remain calm under pressure. "I said, let me know if you need anything else," Rebecca repeated, feigning innocence, but the scowl on her face and her dismissive tone remained. Angela swallowed, forcing herself to maintain composure. The last thing she wanted was to cause a scene, but she also knew she couldn't let blatant disrespect slide unnoticed. She watched as Rebecca walked away, noticing how the attendant rolled her eyes while conversing with Craig. It was as if Angela's presence and her traditional attire was an affront, Tanya whispered. "Let it go for now. We'll address it properly if it continues." Angela nodded, mentally preparing how she might file a formal complaint if necessary. This was not the first time she'd had to stand up for herself and others in such situations. Yet it saddened her that even in an era of supposed progress, a professional airline crew member could act so blatantly discriminatory. Focusing on her lunch, grilled chicken with a side of mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, and a small fruit salad, Angela tried to center herself. She reminded herself that her mission was bigger than this moment, bigger than Rebecca's microaggressions. But as the plane soared through the clouds, Angela couldn't shake the growing tension in the cabin. She sensed that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the start of a series of confrontations that would test her patience, dignity, and sense of self-worth. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into cruising altitude. Passengers around Angela and Tanya either reclined their seats for a nap or opened laptops to tackle last-minute work. Outside, cotton candy clouds drifted past the windows, illuminated by the midday sun. Usually, Angela would take this time to catch up on reading or even indulge in a short break. Self-care during hectic travel was crucial, but today the atmosphere felt far from restful. Halfway through the meal service, Angela realized she needed more water. Dehydration was a frequent issue on long flights, and staying hydrated helped keep her mind sharp. She pressed the call button. A few minutes passed with no response. Meanwhile, she saw flight attendants bustling around, collecting trays and offering dessert. She pressed the call button again, still no response. Finally, Rebecca emerged from the galley, wearing an exasperated look. She stopped by Angela's seat, hands on her hips. "You rang?" she asked. Angela took a careful breath. "Yes, I was wondering if I could get some more water, please." Rebecca's eyes flickered, and a sarcastic smile danced on her lips. Water's right there in your glass, she said, pointing at the half-full cup from earlier. Finish that first. Tanya's eyebrows shot up, and Angela felt her patience wearing thin. I prefer fresh water, Angela said calmly. I've had this cup for a while, and the ice has melted. Could I have a fresh glass, or maybe a bottle? With an exaggerated sigh, Rebecca shrugged. Fine, she said, snatching Angela's glass from the tray table. She returned a moment later with a water bottle, almost slamming it down. Anything else? She asked, her tone drenched in sarcasm. Tanya decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. Is there a problem? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Because you're speaking to us in a way that's quite disrespectful. My friend has been very polite, so I'm not sure what the issue is. Rebecca's mouth tightened. I'm treating you exactly like every other passenger, she said quickly. I'm sorry if you feel otherwise. Yet her voice held a cold edge that suggested she was anything but sorry. Angela reached out to place a hand on Tanya's arm, signaling her to remain calm. The last thing Angela wanted was a confrontation in a confined space 30,000 feet above the ground. Thank you for the water, Angela said, maintaining her composure. That'll be all. Rebecca nodded curtly and walked away. Angela watched as she went, noticing that other passengers were starting to look over. A man across the aisle frowned at the altercation, while an older woman glanced at Angela's outfit and shook her head disapprovingly, though Angela couldn't tell whether the disapproval was for the outfit or for Rebecca's attitude. Leaning back in her seat, Angela tried to soothe the tension, knotting her shoulders. She prepared for her London conference meticulously, rehearsing her speech and analysing data for weeks. Never had she anticipated that a simple request for water would turn into a heated exchange. In her line of work, Angela had faced entire governments that were slow to adopt progressive policies, and she'd navigated the labyrinth of cultural complexities in more countries than she could count. Yet she always found that small, everyday acts of disrespect could cut deeper than formal opposition, because they targeted one's dignity so directly. The rest of the meal service passed uneventfully, as Rebecca seemed to avoid Angela's row. Meanwhile, Craig and Samantha went about their duties as if nothing were amiss. Tanya quietly continued to fume on Angela's behalf, but Angela insisted they focus on their upcoming tasks. Still, a sense of dread gnawed at the pit of Angela's stomach, telling her that Rebecca's behavior was a storm cloud looming over the cabin, and it was only a matter of time before the skies opened up. A few hours into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed further, signaling a rest period. Many passengers took this as an opportunity to nap. Angela and Tanya, however, decided to review the key points of their London presentation. They angled their reading lights and opened a laptop, carefully browsing through slides that highlighted case studies from diverse regions. Occasionally, they whispered comments to each other, mindful of those trying to sleep. Let's emphasize success stories in East Africa, Angela noted. People respond better to tangible human stories than raw data. That'll set the tone before we show the graphs. Tanya nodded. Good idea. Also, Dr. Delgado will likely talk about microloans in South America, so we can segue smoothly into that. They were so absorbed in their work that they barely noticed a man approach from behind their seats. He was tall, wearing a neat suit, and looked to be in his mid-50s. With a polite smile, he gestured to get their attention. Angela paused her conversation, turning around. "Pardon me," the man said, in a soft British accent. "I couldn't help overhearing bits of your discussion on microfinance and women's empowerment. Are you part of the Un-Women conference in London?" Angela and Tanya exchanged a surprised look. "Yes, we are," Angela replied. "I'm Angela Woods, and this is Tanya Reynolds. We're with Un-Women, heading to the conference to present our latest findings and advocacy plans." The man's face lit up. "Delighted to meet you. My name is Peter Albright. I'm with the BBC's Global Affairs section. I'm actually heading to the same conference, hoping to cover some of the sessions. Perhaps we could chat further? I'm always looking for compelling stories and would love to hear more about your work. Angela smiled, grateful for a friendly face. That would be wonderful. Maybe after the lights come back up, we can talk in the galley area or near the lounge seats at the front of the cabin. Peter nodded enthusiastically, glancing momentarily at Angela's Kenty wrap skirt. I admire your outfit, by the way. Beautiful design. It reminds me of some of the textiles I saw while reporting in Ghana. Thank you, Angela replied, feeling a surge of validation that countered the early attention from Rebecca. It's kente cloth indeed, from Ghana. As Peter returned to his seat, Tanya grinned. We might get some media coverage out of this flight, talk about networking in high places, literally. They returned to their work, but the exchange had lifted Angela's spirits. She had long believed in the power of connecting with like-minded people, even in the most unexpected places. Perhaps fate had put Peter in the seat behind them for a reason, and maybe this positive encounter was a reminder that while prejudice existed, so did allies. Still, the uneasy knot in Angela's stomach refused to fully disappear. A short while later, she stood to stretch her legs. Walking toward the front of the cabin, she spotted Rebecca on her phone in a small alcove near the cockpit door. The flight attendant looked up, locking eyes with Angela for a moment, her expression unreadable but taut with tension. Despite the negativity swirling around her, Angela reminded herself of her purpose. She was representing millions of women worldwide who deserved respect and dignity. If she allowed one person's biases to shake her confidence, what message would that send to those who looked to her for leadership? Gathering her resolve, Angela decided to remain steadfast, to conduct herself with grace. Perhaps she could even prove a point, not just about cultural attire, but about the resilience that grew from embracing one's heritage. As she returned to her seat, Angela made a silent vow she would not let anyone's mockery or scorn weigh her down. Her mission was far bigger than any single flight attendant's prejudice. And in just a few more hours, she would land in London, ready to shine a spotlight on issues that truly mattered. About 5 hours into the flight, somewhere over the North Atlantic, turbulence rattled the plane. The captain's calm voice crackled over the intercom, advising everyone to remain seated and fasten their seat belts. Flight attendants scurried to secure carts and instruct passengers to stow away loose belongings. Angela felt her heart jump as the aircraft shook, but she reminded herself that turbulence, while unnerving, was usually manageable. Tanya placed a reassuring hand on Angela's arm. "It'll pass soon," she whispered. Angela nodded, focusing on her breathing. Over the years, she'd learned to manage flight anxiety by anchoring her thoughts in positive outcomes, like the moment she would finally step onto the conference stage and champion the rights of women and girls. As the turbulence intensified, a sudden lurch sent a tray of cups crashing to the aisle floor. Water splashed onto the seats of 2 passengers in the row ahead. Craig rushed over with napkins, apologizing profusely. Rebecca was not far behind, though her face held an air of frustration. She barked orders at Craig to retrieve more cleaning supplies, then turned to see Angela and Tanya watching the scene. "Fasten your seat belts, please," Rebecca snapped, her tone carrying more aggression than concern. Angela and Tanya, who were already strapped in, merely nodded. It was a tense moment, made worse by the plane's violent shudder. Then, suddenly, an overhead bin in the economy cabin popped open, scattering a couple of carry-on bags onto the floor. Alarmed passengers cried out. Samantha hurried to help, and Angela craned her neck to see if anyone was hurt. The seatbelt sign glowed insistently, and the plane jolted again. After a few moments, the turbulence began to subside, but the cabin remained on edge. Craig announced over the power system that they would remain seated for a while until conditions stabilized. Gradually, The plane's shaking decreased to gentle bumps, and a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the cabin. However, the momentary crisis seemed to fray Rebecca's composure even further. As she stalked through the aisle to check on passengers, her posture was rigid, her jaw set in an angry line. When she reached Angela and Tanya's row, she paused, briefly scanning Angela from head to toe, as though she were an unwelcome intruder rather than a paying passenger. With a curt nod, Rebecca moved on. Tanya exhaled loudly once Rebecca was out of earshot. "That woman is unbelievable," she muttered. "It's like she's blaming you for the turbulence or something." Angela managed a small laugh, though her nerves were still taut from the sudden jolt. "I've seen blame directed in all sorts of places, but blaming me for bad weather might be a new record." A passenger across the aisle, an older man wearing a tweed jacket, leaned over. "Don't let her get to you," he whispered kindly. "I've flown Delta for years, and most of their crew is wonderful." "This one seems to have some chip on her shoulder." Angela thanked him. She found solace in these small gestures of solidarity. The plane might have hit turbulence, but she was reminded that life's storms could bring out acts of kindness in others. Still, Angela sensed that the tension with Rebecca was far from resolved. The flight attendant seemed to harbor a growing hostility that threatened to escalate at any moment. For Angela, the turbulence was more than just a physical jostling of the aircraft. It symbolized the emotional and social turbulence she was experiencing on this flight. But even as the seatbelt sign finally blinked off, Angela knew there was no sign that Rebecca's attitude would follow suit. In fact, the worst was yet to come. A lull settled over the cabin after the turbulence passed. Most passengers returned to whatever they were doing, sleeping, reading, or watching in-flight entertainment. Angela decided to freshen up and excused herself to visit the lavatory. Tanya stayed behind, organizing their notes. In the narrow aisle leading to the lavatories, Angela ended up behind a small queue of passengers, including a middle-aged woman who was struggling to calm her crying toddler. Angela offered a sympathetic smile, recalling the times she'd helped her nieces and nephews during flights. Just then, she heard footsteps behind her and felt an air of tension before she even turned around. Rebecca was there, arms folded, her gaze scrutinizing Angela's Kente skirt. The flight attendant spoke in a low tone that dripped with condescension. "Is that really the best thing to wear on a plane?" she sneered. "Might want to consider more practical clothing next time." Angela felt her pulse quicken. She maintained her composure, replying softly, "This is what I choose to wear. It has cultural significance to me." Rebecca scoffed, glancing around at the other passengers who were trying not to eavesdrop. "Cultural significance or not," she said, "we have a dress code for business-class travelers. Typically, that includes attire that won't offend or disturb others." Angela blinked. "Offend or disturb others? My skirt is no more revealing than any other outfit." Rebecca crossed her arms more tightly. "I've had complaints," she lied. "People are worried you're making a statement. You know, politics, religion, whatever else. This is an international flight. We have to respect everyone's comfort." Angela's throat tightened. She was aware of how deeply certain cultural garbs could be misunderstood. But a colorful kente skirt hardly constituted political propaganda, nor was it hateful or lewd. If anything, it was a testament to her pride in her African roots and heritage. Before she could respond, the middle-aged woman with the toddler turned around. Her eyes blazed with indignation. "I'm sorry, but I'm not offended," she said, balancing the toddler on her hip. "Your skirt is beautiful, and if anyone is offended by it, that's their problem, not yours." A flicker of embarrassment crossed Rebecca's face, but instead of backing down, she snapped, "Monsieur A.M., this is between the airline and a passenger. Please don't interfere." Angela sensed the atmosphere becoming charged. Others in line were starting to pay closer attention. Their curiosity piqued. Angela inhaled, steadying her nerves. "Rebecca," she said quietly. Please understand that my attire is neither a political statement nor an attempt to disrespect anyone. I am simply being myself, and I am an ambassador for unwomen. I travel frequently, and no one has ever made an issue of my clothing like this before. Rebecca laughed, though it lacked humor. An ambassador, huh? Well, if that's the case, you should know better than to stir up controversy. If you want to avoid further issues, I suggest you stick to standard business attire next time. For now, let's just get through this flight without causing any more of a scene. Angela's hands trembled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She knew she had every right to stand her ground. Yet she also recognized that making a scene in the aisle might escalate matters unnecessarily, so she clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain calm. The toddler whimpered, sensing the tension. Rebecca's eyes flickered toward the child, and with a final glare at Angela, she stomped off toward the galley. Trembling, Angela went into the lavatory once it was free. She locked the door behind her and leaned against the sink, willing her heart to slow. She splashed cool water on her face. In the mirror, she saw not just her reflection, but the reflection of every woman she represented, those who faced prejudice, bias, and misunderstanding on a daily basis. As tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, Angela reminded herself, "You are stronger than this. You've faced far worse in your line of work. Do not let hatred overshadow your mission." When she emerged, she found the corridor empty. The mother with the toddler had presumably returned to her seat, and Rebecca was nowhere in sight. But the words lingered in Angela's mind like a dark cloud, threatening to steal the warmth of the thousands of miles she had traveled for the sake of equality and justice. Little did either of them know that this confrontation was just the prelude to a much bigger reckoning. Angela walked slowly back to her seat, her thoughts churning with a whirlwind of emotions, anger, hurt, and a deep sense of injustice. She wondered if she should confront Rebecca publicly or quietly report her behavior to higher authorities after landing. But just as she settled beside Tanya, the older man across the aisle leaned over and spoke in a hushed tone. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "It's appalling behavior from the staff. I've taken note of her name. You might want to speak with the head flight attendant or even file a formal complaint with Delta." Angela nodded gratefully. "Thank you for your concern. I appreciate the support." Peter Albright, the BBC journalist, overheard from a row behind. He unbuckled his seatbelt and scooted over to the aisle next to Angela. "I saw some of what happened," he said, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb other passengers. "It's absolutely unacceptable. If you'd like, I can help document this in some way." Tanya looked up, her eyes flickering with relief. "We absolutely need this on record. Angela's an ambassador. She shouldn't be treated like this. No one should." Angela hesitated. While part of her wanted to handle the matter discreetly, she also recognized that silence sometimes enabled further abuse. "I'm not one to jump straight to public exposure," she said carefully. "But having a witness statement or someone who can corroborate what happened might be useful, especially if the airline tries to brush this under the rug." Peter nodded, understanding her dilemma. "We can start with an internal complaint. If the airline doesn't act properly, then perhaps it becomes a story. But first and foremost, your comfort and dignity matter. And I'm sure Delta would want to address such unprofessional behavior." Angela exhaled, feeling a mixture of gratitude and weariness. "Yes, let's do that," she said, turning to Tanya. "Could you take the lead on writing up some notes about the incidents? We'll gather statements from anyone who's willing." Tanya agreed. "I'll talk to the mother with the toddler if she's up for it." She witnessed part of the confrontation. Peter offered a supportive smile. "I'm at your service. Just let me know what you need." At that moment, Samantha passed through the aisle. Seeing the small gathering, she asked politely, "Is everything all right here?" Angela glanced at Peter and then at Tanya before turning her attention to Samantha. Carefully, she explained the situation. Samantha's eyes widened in dismay as she listened, and she expressed genuine concern. "I'm so sorry to hear that. I promise you most of us want all our passengers to have a comfortable and respectful journey. I don't know what's gotten into Rebecca lately. She's usually not like this." "It's not just a one-time slip," Angela said. "There have been multiple microaggressions, comments about my clothing, and a confrontational attitude." Samantha's expression grew more troubled. "I understand. Let me talk to the purser and see if there's something we can do to de-escalate this. In the meantime, please accept my apologies on behalf of Delta Airlines." With that, Samantha hurried off, looking genuinely distressed. Angela felt a slight weight lift from her shoulders, knowing that at least one member of the crew was taking her concerns seriously. She clasped her hands together, resisting the urge to cry out of frustration. She had come onto this flight with the sole intention of resting, preparing her notes, and arriving in London ready to advocate for women's rights. Now she found herself advocating for her own right to be treated with respect. Yet amidst this turmoil, Angela realized she was not alone. The unexpected allies, from the man across the aisle to the supportive mother with the toddler, and especially Peter Albright, reminded her that people of goodwill could be found anywhere. Even in the confined cabin of a transatlantic flight, empathy could break through prejudice, forging connections that defied the limitations of space and time. As the flight neared its final 2 hours, the seatbelt sign lit up once again. The captain announced that they would soon begin their descent into London, though some intermittent turbulence was expected due to high winds. Angela was ready for this journey to be over, her nerves frayed by constant vigilance against Rebecca's hostility. Not long after the announcement, a commotion erupted near the economy cabin. A voice over the intercom called for any medical personnel on board to identify themselves. Alarm rippled through the passengers. Angela's heart sank as she wondered if someone had a severe allergic reaction or a sudden illness. Within moments, the purser, a middle-aged man named George, rushed toward business class, his expression tight with urgency. He called out, "Is there a doctor here? We have a medical emergency." A doctor sitting near the front promptly rose, volunteering his services. Angela noticed that George was accompanied by Rebecca, who looked pale and anxious. They guided the doctor toward a row of seats in economy. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, but the cabin crew asked everyone to remain seated. A tense 20 minutes followed. The plane experienced light turbulence, and the crew had to juggle safety protocols while tending to the emergency. Angela closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer for whoever was in distress. Suddenly, Samantha approached Angela and Tanya. "We have a passenger in crisis," she whispered. "He's having severe chest pains, and the doctor suspects a heart attack." The doctors asked for someone to assist with translations. He only speaks limited English, and the passenger seems to speak French, or maybe a West African language. "I noticed you mentioned some African connections. Would you be able to help if it's a language you know?" Angela's thoughts raced. While she spoke French fluently and had some familiarity with a few West African dialects, she wasn't entirely sure if she could communicate with the patient effectively. Nonetheless, she nodded, resolved to do what she could. "Yes, I speak French and Twi. I can try to help." Samantha guided Angela down the aisle, where they found an older man clutching his chest, sweat beading on his forehead. The doctor was trying to keep him calm, but communication barriers were evident. Angela switched to French. "Monsieur, parlez-vous français?" she asked gently. "Oui," he croaked, breathing hard. "Je m'appelle Angela. Je suis là pour vous aider," Angela said, explaining the doctor's instructions about breathing slowly and trying to remain calm. She asked about symptoms, pain levels, and any medications he might be taking. Though she wasn't a medical professional, her language skills became the crucial link between the patient and the doctor. As Angela translated, she noticed Rebecca standing to the side, her face twisted with conflicting emotions. It was as though reality had slapped her in the face. The same woman she had belittled for wearing inappropriate attire and stirring controversy was now providing life-saving assistance in an unexpected moment. Angela caught Rebecca's eye for a fleeting second, and in that moment she saw the flight attendant's cheeks flush with what looked like shame. Rebecca lowered her gaze, fidgeting nervously as Angela continued to speak to the patient, calmly relaying the doctor's advice to stay still and keep his airway open. Eventually, the doctor administered medication to stabilize the man's condition, reassuring everyone that he seemed to be out of immediate danger, although he would need hospital care upon landing. Relieved murmurs rippled through the cabin. Angela took a moment to speak softly to the man in French, comforting him until he drifted into a more stable state. When the situation stabilized, the purser thanked Angela profusely. She nodded, worn out but grateful she could help. Rebecca lingered, staring at Angela with a mixture of awe and regret. Karma, it seemed, had arrived in the form of a medical emergency that showcased Angela's capabilities and compassion qualities that defied the shallow judgments Rebecca had clung to for most of the flight. The plane prepared for its final descent, the city lights of London coming into view beyond the windows. A subdued hush fell over the cabin as everyone mentally transitioned from the chaos in the sky to the anticipation of landing. Angela, back in her seat, let out a long breath. She and Tanya exchanged looks, both reflecting on the dramatic flight they had experienced. Shortly before the seatbelt sign illuminated for the final approach, George the purser came by with a grave expression. He crouched down beside Angela and Tanya's seats so he could speak quietly. "Miss Woods, Miss Reynolds, on behalf of Delta Airlines, I'd like to extend our apologies for any unpleasantness you've encountered. Samantha mentioned you had issues with a member of our crew?" Angela nodded, her voice quiet. "Yes, we did. Rebecca has been making comments about my attire and has been generally hostile. We plan to file a complaint upon landing." George sighed, his forehead furrowing. "I'm very sorry. That's not in line with our standards. Rest assured, I will be documenting everything. Our corporate office will follow up, and you'll be hearing from us regarding next steps." At that moment, Rebecca appeared behind George, her face ashen. She looked visibly shaken by the events of the day. With a trembling voice, she spoke directly to Angela. I want to apologize," she began, stumbling over the words. "I said things I shouldn't have. I was unfair to you, and I judged you wrongly." Angela could see that remorse was genuine, though it came belatedly. She searched Rebecca's face for signs of sincerity. "I appreciate the apology," Angela said carefully. "I'm willing to accept it, but I also hope you understand why this situation was hurtful. The comments you made weren't just about my clothing, they carried assumptions about who I am." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "I do understand now. I let my personal biases get the better of me, and seeing you help that passenger, speaking to him in his language, it was humbling. I know I have a lot to learn." George cleared his throat, placing a reassuring hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "We will address the matter internally, Miss Woods. I want you to know this apology is genuine, but it doesn't absolve our responsibility as an airline to ensure respectful treatment of all passengers." A moment of silence followed, during which Angela's mind swirled with conflicting emotions: anger, relief, empathy, and a cautious sense of forgiveness. She could have lashed out, demanding that Rebecca face severe repercussions, but Angela had devoted her life to understanding and bridging cultural divides. This didn't mean she condoned Rebecca's actions, but she believed in the possibility of growth. "I accept your apology, Angela said quietly, folding her hands in her lap. "But I do expect that, going forward, you'll treat passengers of all backgrounds with dignity and respect." Rebecca wiped her eyes. "I will, thank you." George rose, quietly retreating with Rebecca. The plane's announcement signaled the final approach, instructing everyone to return to their seats and buckle up. As Angela adjusted her seatbelt, she glanced at Tanya, who offered a supportive nod. Whatever the outcome, Angela felt a measure of closure. The flight had begun in tension and prejudice, but it was ending in an admission of fault and a promise, however tentative, of transformation. The wheels touched down on the runway at London Heathrow, sending a slight jolt through the cabin. A collective sigh of relief and excitement passed through the passengers, some applauding, others stretching and yawning, all eager to deplane and carry on with their lives. For Angela, the final taxi to the gate felt like the conclusion of a turbulent but enlightening chapter. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, everyone stood, gathering their belongings. Angela and Tanya packed up their laptops and papers, taking special care not to leave behind any of the documents they needed for the conference. As they waited for the aisle to clear, Peter Albright approached them again. "Angela, Tanya," he said, "I'm sorry this flight was so rocky for you, but I'm glad we connected. Let's exchange contact information. Maybe we can meet in London after the conference sessions, or I could interview you for a piece on the BBC." Angela smiled warmly, handing him a business card. "Absolutely. We'd be happy to share more about our work. Thank you for your support during the flight." Peter pocketed the card with a nod. "My pleasure. I'll be in touch." The mother with the toddler also paused by Angela's seat. "Thank you for standing up for yourself and for people who wear their heritage proudly," she said softly. "I'm going to teach my daughter to celebrate all cultures, just like you do." Angela's heart warmed. "That means a lot. Safe travels." As the passengers slowly filed out of the plane, Angela noticed Rebecca standing by the exit, her posture more subdued than before. Typically, flight attendants offered parting pleasantries to each passenger, thank yous, goodbyes, and well wishes. Rebecca looked unsure of herself, but when Angela and Tanya reached her, she mustered a polite smile. "Have a good day," she said, her voice still tinged with remorse. Angela returned the smile, albeit with reserved warmth. "You too. Take care," she replied, stepping into the jet bridge. In the terminal, Angela and Tanya were greeted by the bustling energy of Heathrow travellers from every corner of the globe, shops advertising luxury goods, and overhead announcements in multiple languages. Angela felt her shoulders relax, as though she'd finally shed the weight of the conflict on the plane. She was free now to focus on the London conference, a platform where her voice could resonate far beyond the confines of an airplane cabin. They made their way through immigration and customs, presenting their diplomatic and official passports. The process was relatively smooth, and soon they found themselves in the arrivals hall, scanning the sea of faces for the undriver sent to pick them up. Tanya spotted a man holding a sign with "Unwomen" written in bold letters. They approached him, and he greeted them with a courteous nod. "In the car, I'll go through our notes and see if we need to add anything about the flight incident," Tanya whispered as they walked. "Just to keep a record." Angela nodded. "Yes, let's do that. But first, let's focus on the conference. After that, I'll decide how to proceed with Delta. I do think it's important they receive a formal report." They stepped outside into the crisp London air, taking in the familiar smell of city life, a mix of car exhaust, distant coffee shops, and damp concrete. Angela inhaled deeply, feeling gratitude for the new day, new opportunities, and the chance to speak for women who couldn't speak for themselves. Despite the exhaustion from the flight, Angela felt a surge of optimism. The world was flawed and filled with prejudice, yes, but she had witnessed kindness too. She had seen strangers stand up for one another, had offered assistance to someone in need, and had even watched an unlikely transformation begin in a person she'd thought was irredeemably biased. In the grand tapestry of her work, this single flight was but one thread, a vivid illustration of both the challenges and triumphs woven into the fabric of advocacy. As the driver guided them to the waiting car, Angela tightened the scarf around her shoulders, a final flourish of the vibrant kente cloth. She would wear it again at the conference, taking the stage with confidence, because her attire was part of her identity, her story, and her mission. And no one, not even a prejudiced flight attendant, could ever take that away. Thank you for watching Angela's inspiring journey from Atlanta to London, where she had to overcome ignorance and hostility before landing to fulfill her mission as an international ambassador for unwomen. This story reminds us that prejudice can surface in the most mundane places: a plane ride, a casual comment, or even a simple request for water. Yet, we also witnessed the power of empathy, allyship, and personal growth. Angela's unwavering dignity and her willingness to forgive revealed that transformative change can begin anywhere, even at 30,000 feet in the air. If you found this story meaningful, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing impactful stories that inspire kindness, resilience, and understanding across cultures. Together, let's raise our voices to celebrate diversity and create a more inclusive world for everyone.